They smelled it before they saw it. Warm bread. Coffee. And something sweet, something no German soldier had tasted in years. The train had stopped hours ago. The men were herded out in silence, under a sky that felt too big, too blue. Texas, they were told. The air was thick with heat and dust, smelling of grass, diesel, and, impossibly, sugar. After weeks in cattle cars and months of defeat, they had expected concrete walls, shouting guards, dogs. But when the gates of Camp Hearn swung open, there were no guns pointed at them, no barbed wire shining with malice. Just a row of low wooden barracks, a flag snapping lazily in the wind, and a smell drifting from a building-marked kitchen. Gefreiter Karl Müller, who had fought at Salerno and been captured near Naples, wrote in his diary that night. They said Americans feed their prisoners like kings. I thought it was a lie. The guards led them through a narrow path lined with sandbags and cactus. The sun glared off the tin roofs, cicadas buzzed like invisible engines. The prisoners squinted against the brightness. The war had been gray for so long that color itself felt like an insult. When they reached the mess hall, a man in a white apron stood by the door, smiling awkwardly. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms thick with flour dust. The smell coming from behind him was unbearable, rich, warm, alive. The kind of smell that made you forget everything ugly for a moment. Inside, one of the American guards said. They stepped in. Long tables. Tin trays. Coffee pots steaming. On each plate, eggs, bread, a pat of butter, and a slice of apple pie. The sound of boots scraping stopped. Nobody moved. Karl looked at the food and then at the guard who had escorted them from the train. The man just nodded, his expression unreadable. One of the older soldiers whispered, "They'll make us eat, then ask questions." Another muttered, "Poison." But the smell said otherwise, the cinnamon and sugar, the baked apples, the butter. It was the scent of homes they'd lost, of kitchens they would never see again. Still, no one touched the pie. The Americans didn't seem to notice. The cooks moved from table to table, refilling coffee, offering more bread. No shouting, no orders. Just the quiet rhythm of breakfast. After 15 minutes, the head guard, a tall man with tired eyes and captain's bars on his shoulder, walked in. He surveyed the room, the untouched plates, the rigid faces. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm. No one answered. The prisoners sat still, hands on their knees. Finally, one man stood up, Franz Becker, an artillery sergeant from Hamburg. He was thin, his uniform hanging off him like a borrowed suit. He pointed to the food and asked in halting English, "Where's the punishment?" The American captain blinked. "Punishment?" The interpreter repeated the question in German. Murmurs spread across the hall. The Americans exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or be offended. Then the captain said simply, "Eat. It's breakfast." When no one moved, he added, "You earned it by staying alive." He turned and left. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow ticking of a wall clock and the wind outside pressing against the tin walls. Finally, one of the younger men, barely 18, picked up his fork. He cut a small piece of the pie, lifted it to his mouth, and tasted. He froze. Swallowed. Took another bite. Someone laughed. Another whispered, "So this is defeat." Karl Müller wrote later, "It was not sweetness I tasted. It was confusion. The kind that makes you ashamed to still be human." The laughter faded. Soon, all that could be heard was the quiet scrape of metal forks on tin plates. Outside, the sun rose higher. The guards leaned on their rifles, watching without expression. For them, it was just another morning shift. For the prisoners, it was something they couldn't yet name, the moment the war inside them began to crack. By the end of the meal, the coffee was gone. The plates were clean. But the air in the hall felt heavy, like everyone had swallowed something they couldn't digest. That night, Carl wrote one more line in his notebook, just before lights out. No one touched the pie at first. We thought it was a trick. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Eat, boys, said the American guard. It's dessert. You earned it by staying alive. The words didn't fit the place. A prisoner of war camp was supposed to sound like iron gates, shouted orders, boots in the dirt, not kindness. Yet here it was, spoken in a drawl soft enough to feel like a mistake. The men sat motionless before their trays. Dozens of Germans, still in dust-colored uniforms, their faces drawn from heat and travel, their hands rough from months of surrender. The pie sat in front of them, steam curling into the hot Texas air, untouched. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cornmeal, butter melting on the griddle, and something almost holy to men who'd spent the last 3 years living on tinned meat and despair. A few of the younger soldiers stared at their food as if it might vanish. Others looked to the guards for permission, then to their officers for direction. Captain Harold Evans, the commandant of Camp Hearn, stood by the doorway, watching. He had fought in North Africa, seen real cruelty, and had decided that decency was the stronger weapon. You feed a man right, he once told his cooks, and he'll remember what being human feels like. Now he watched the Germans wrestle with that very idea. He approached the table slowly, his boots silent against the wooden floor. "What's wrong with it?" he asked. No answer. He turned to the interpreter, who repeated the question in German. After a moment, one prisoner, the same sergeant who'd spoken earlier, Becker, stood and pointed at the slice of pie. His voice cracked when he asked, "Where's the punishment?" Evans blinked. "There is none." The interpreter hesitated, unsure whether to translate it literally. When he finally did, the words hung in the air like something dangerous. Becker sat down. No one moved. Across the room, one of the American cooks, a stocky man named Joe Marino, shook his head in disbelief. "They look more scared of the pie than our guns," he muttered. Evans almost smiled. "Let them figure it out," he said. For a few eternal minutes, no one spoke. Then, as if some invisible signal had passed through the room, forks lifted. The sound was faint, the first scrape of tin, cautious, deliberate. Someone laughed nervously. Another swallowed too fast and coughed. The pie was sweet, the crust soft, the filling warm with cinnamon. For many of the men, it was their first taste of fruit in years. But the sweetness didn't land easily. It felt like betrayal, a reminder of what they had been told about America, and what they now saw with their own eyes. Karl Muller, the quiet infantryman from Salerno, later wrote in his diary. "When they brought us pie, I thought they wanted to make us talk. But they just left it there. The guards watched us as if waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Except I began to wonder what else they had lied to us about." That night, few of them slept. The barracks were quiet except for the buzz of insects and the groan of the desert wind. Some whispered that the food was part of an interrogation trick, that the Americans wanted to make them grateful, to soften them before questions came. But no questions came. Only more meals. 3 days later, they were issued new clothes, khaki shirts stamped PW on the back, and taken to the camp fields. The work was light, clearing brush, hauling water, maintaining fences. No beatings, no insults, just instructions and the expectation that they would obey. Franz Becker, still skeptical, tested the boundaries. He pocketed a potato from the field kitchen and expected to be punished. When the guard saw it, he just shrugged. "Hungry, huh? Take 2 next time." It disarmed him more than any threat could have. Inside the camp, the rules were strict but fair. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but there were no dogs, no towers with machine guns pointed inward. Escape was possible, a few tried, but the nearest town was miles away, and the desert was harsher than any prison wall. Most stayed. Within weeks, the routine began to feel eerily normal. Morning roll call at dawn. Work detail. Lunch. Letters from home, delivered once a month. Dinner. Then lights out at 9. The real shock came with payday. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were to receive a small wage for labor. At Herne, that meant tokens they could spend at the camp canteen, a converted storage shed where an American corporal sold cigarettes, postcards, razor blades, and occasionally, Hershey bars. The first time a German soldier bit into American chocolate, the entire barrack went silent. It was like tasting another planet. Some saved the wrappers, folding them carefully into their diaries. Others mailed them home, proof that the enemy was not what the Reich had promised. In August, the heat grew unbearable. Temperatures in central Texas reached 100 degrees. The prisoners built shade screens from canvas and wood. They played soccer on dusty fields, painted murals on their barrack walls, even built small gardens along the fences. The Americans didn't stop them. Private Robert Hines, a 20-year-old guard from Ohio, wrote to his sister. They act more like neighbors than prisoners. One of them fixed my wristwatch yesterday. I think he used to build engines for the Luftwaffe. In the evenings, as the light faded, the Germans sometimes sang. Old folk songs, nothing military, just the kind of music that reminded them of home. The guards listened from a distance, cigarettes glowing in the dark, not sure whether to feel pity or respect. But beneath the fragile calm, something else was happening, something the prisoners themselves could barely name. For men raised under years of propaganda and obedience, the idea of fairness felt dangerous. To be treated with dignity by an enemy made them question everything, their leaders, their war, even themselves. One night, a prisoner named Otto leaned toward Karl Muller in the barrack's half-light and whispered, "What if we were wrong?" Karl didn't answer. But later, when the guards passed by for inspection, he noticed how gently they stepped, trying not to wake anyone. The next morning, breakfast was the same: eggs, bread, butter, coffee. But at the end of the line, the cook handed out something extra, small plates with slices of apple pie. This time, no one hesitated. Men ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid to finish too soon. A few smiled. One even laughed. The sound startled the guards. When the meal ended, a young soldier approached the counter, holding his empty plate. The cook looked up, expecting a complaint. Instead, the prisoner pointed to the remains of the crust and asked, in broken English, "Can I have the recipe?" Marino blinked, then grinned. "Sure, buddy," he said. "But I don't think you'll find much butter in Germany." The man smiled back, shy and tired, and returned to his seat. That night, under the wide Texas sky, the camp was quieter than usual. Somewhere beyond the wire, a train passed, its whistle long and low. Inside the barracks, men dreamed of home, of kitchens, of their mothers' hands dusted with flour, of peace. In his notebook, Karl wrote one final line before the lights went out. "They did not feed us to break us. They fed us to remind us what we had forgotten, that kindness is stronger than fear." And for the first time since his capture, he slept without nightmares. By 1944, American POW camps looked less like prisons and more like small towns. At Camp Herne, mornings began with the whistle of roll call, the smell of coffee drifting between the barracks, and sunlight flashing off tin roofs. Men queued with tin cups, traded cigarettes for soap, and learned the rhythm of captivity: work, eat, rest, repeat. The fences were still there, but the fear had faded into routine. Across the United States, more than 370,000 German soldiers lived behind such fences, in cornfields, deserts, and forests. They worked the land, built roads, and earned small wages in camp tokens. They wrote letters home on thin blue paper, each line censored in black ink. In return, they received packages of tobacco and photos of wives and children, folded soft from travel. Herne had its own pulse. Prisoners grew flowers in tin cans and hung curtains over the barrack windows. Someone built a bookshelf from scrap wood, another painted a mural of mountains, just to remember what color cold looked like. The camp library offered Goethe beside Steinbeck. In the evenings, men played chess or soccer until the ball disappeared in the Texas dust. Guards leaned on their rifles, half cheering when someone scored. The war felt far away, but it was there, in the letters, the rumors, the silence after news broadcasts from Houston. The Americans followed orders: fair treatment, good food, no cruelty. For many Germans, that was the strangest part. Kindness felt like interrogation. Karl Muller wrote, "They give us meat twice a week. They let us rest on Sundays. They even smile. I cannot tell if this is mercy or mockery." Work details took prisoners to nearby farms. Locals watched from porches as men in khaki overalls picked cotton or fixed fences. Soon, suspicion gave way to necessity. With so many Texans fighting overseas, the harvest depended on German labor. Farmers learned a few words of German: gut, fertig, schnell, and sometimes shared lemonade in the heat. Inside the camp, life reshaped itself into something oddly domestic. A small chapel opened on Sundays. The guards let the Germans use it afterward for their own service. The hymns drifted through the open windows, unfamiliar but beautiful. One day in the mess hall, a black kitchen crew sat beside German prisoners for lunch. A soldier from Bremen stared, confused. "They eat with us," he whispered. No one answered. Later he wrote, "We realized how little we knew about the world." By December, the air had cooled, the desert nights sharp and clear. For Christmas 1944, Captain Harold Evans, the camp commandant, approved a request from the prisoners to bake something from home. Flour, sugar, apples, whatever they could find. The Americans helped, curious. Together they built makeshift ovens from metal barrels and old bricks. The smell of baking spread through the camp: cinnamon, butter, apple. Even the guards paused to breathe it in. Someone hung a sign on the door of the mess hall: Apfelkuchen à la Texas. That evening, they shared the pies with the Americans. The slices were uneven, the crusts too thick, but the taste silenced everyone. The guards clapped. The prisoners sang an old song from Bavaria. Laughter returned to the place where fear had once lived. After dinner, a stage made of wooden pallets became a theater. The prisoners performed a play, a clumsy comedy, half in English, half in German. The guards laughed in the wrong places, but it didn't matter. When the curtain, an old blanket, fell, both sides applauded until their hands ached. For the first time, the barbed wire felt like a formality, not a wall. Later that night, Becker, the sergeant, sat outside with Karl under a sky heavy with stars. The air smelled of smoke and apples. "Strange," Becker said quietly. "We came here as enemies, but they treat us like men." Karl didn't answer right away. He watched the distant lights of the guard towers flicker, then said, "Maybe they're showing us what winning is supposed to look like." The camp was silent, except for the hum of insects and the occasional bark of a faraway dog. Somewhere, a guard played harmonica, a slow tune that sounded almost European. Inside the barracks, men slept with full stomachs and clean hands. For the first time in years, many dreamed not of battle, but of kitchens, gardens, and peace. In his diary that night, Karl wrote, "It feels like living inside a memory. The war still exists, but we have stepped out of it, if only for a moment." But that fragile peace, the one they had built from kindness and pie, would soon be tested in ways no one expected. One man cried when he saw the dessert again, not because he was hungry, but because he remembered home. Spring of 1945 came to Texas as a soft wind and a pale, forgiving light. In the camp, the dust settled earlier in the day, the barracks smelled of sun-warmed wood and clean shirts hung on lines. The kitchen woke before dawn for Easter, sacks of flour dragged across the floor, knives thudding softly through apples, the metallic rattle of mixing bowls. Cinnamon bloomed in the air. Men drifted toward the mess hall as if pulled by an old, invisible thread. The first pan came out shining with butter, edges bubbling. An American cook eased it onto the counter and grinned at the waiting prisoners. Someone whispered Apfelkuchen, and the word moved along the line like a blessing. A guard opened the windows, warm air pushed through, and with it the smell, bright, golden, impossible. Otto Reinhardt, once a schoolteacher from Kassel, took a seat by the window. He folded his hands to stop the shaking. Later he wrote, "It smelled like my mother's kitchen. But she died in a bombing raid 2 years ago." When his slice was set down, he did not touch it. He stared until his eyes filled and the crust blurred into the memory of a Sunday table, a lace cloth, the scrape of his mother's chair, the clink of a spoon in a glass. Around him, men hesitated, then yielded. The first bites were careful, almost reverent. A murmur rose, not delight, exactly, but relief. A sweetness that made the jaw ache with everything it asked you to remember. Talk began in fragments. A man from Cologne said the cathedral still stood but the streets around it were gone. Another described a letter that arrived with 3 names crossed out and 1 word left, vermissed. A third said nothing, just held his fork like a pencil and drew the outline of a house on the damp tabletop. Joe Marino, the cook who had sweated over the oven since before dawn, listened without interrupting. He was a veteran of North Africa, forearms mapped with old burns and a healed slice of shrapnel near his elbow. When the room fell quiet, he said softly, "We all lost someone, friend." No sermon, no flag, just the fact of it laid down like a tool. Not everyone ate. At the end of one table a small knot of men sat rigid, hands in their laps. They stared at the pie as if it accused them. "Not today," one said, pushing the plate away. "Not while my sisters are hungry." Another folded his napkin with military precision and whispered that sweetness was for peacetime, not for those who had marched under the black uniform. They punished themselves in the only way left, by refusing what was freely given. Guilt edged the room like barbed wire you could swallow. For some, each bite tasted of betrayal, to parents in air raid shelters, to wives counting potatoes, to children with hollow eyes. The fork became a scale, memory on one side, survival on the other. Men paused between mouthfuls as if bracing for judgment that never came. Otto lifted his slice at last, the steam already gone. He took the smallest corner and set it on his tongue. The crust collapsed with a soft crackle. The apples were warm and sharp, the sugar, gentle as a hand on the shoulder. He chewed and let his eyes close. When he opened them, he saw Karl across the table, doing the same, both men a little ashamed for feeling alive. Outside, the flag barely moved. A mourning dove called from the fence line, its voice slow and hollow. Beyond the wire, an orchard planted by the camp gardeners held 2 stubborn blossoms. A guard walking the perimeter slowed, breathed in, and smiled without meaning to. After the meal, the chapel filled, not for a service, exactly, but for sitting. Some men prayed. Others wrote letters they would never send. One drew staff lines and penciled in a melody he couldn't quite remember, then left the paper on the pew for someone else to complete. In the barracks, Becker polished his boots until they shone like black water and then stopped, staring at his own reflection as if it were a stranger he owed an apology to. Near sunset, small kindnesses multiplied, a cigarette passed, a spoon of jam shared, a story told without heroics. The camp seemed to relax by degrees, as if the fences themselves had exhaled. And still, a bruise of sorrow remained under everything bright. When lights out came, the corridors fell quiet. The kitchen stacked pans to dry. Marino hung his apron by the door and rubbed the ache from his hands. The guards made their rounds, boots soft on the boards. Somewhere a mouth organ tried the first bars of a hymn and faltered. At midnight, Private Hines, pacing the north side, stopped by Barrack 7. On the sill of the open window, cooling in the night air, sat a small, neat slice of apple pie. Beside it lay a folded scrap of paper, held down by a spoon so it would not blow away. He lifted the note and read the careful English, each letter pressed hard into the page. For the dead. He stood there, uncertain whether to move the offering or salute it. In the end he did neither. He left it where the moon could find it, where the sweetness could travel a little farther into the dark. By morning, the plate was empty and the note was gone. And the men woke to the ordinary day, carrying the taste of memory like a weight and a mercy, both at once. In August 1945, censors intercepted a letter from a German prisoner of war. It began, "Dear Mother, the Americans feed us too well." By then, Germany had surrendered. The swastika was ash, Berlin was rubble, and the world was holding its breath between victory and reckoning. Yet in Texas, Camp Hearn still woke each morning to the rattle of dishes, the crackle of flags, and the smell of coffee drifting through the fence. The war was over, but the waiting wasn't. The men behind the wire were no longer soldiers, just displaced lives in borrowed time. They filled their days with work, reading, and long silences. For the first time, the censors allowed letters to travel freely across the Atlantic, though every envelope passed through hands that searched for propaganda, confessions, or regret. Thousands wrote home. Some tried to sound brave, others confessed confusion. One letter read, "They treat us fair. Sometimes I forget I am a prisoner. But then I wake and see the fence." Another, "We eat better than the civilians in Berlin. There is bread every day, meat sometimes, and last week, pie with apples. I can't stop thinking about it." Many of those letters were later archived as evidence of American humanity. At the time, they were simply lifelines, proof to families that their sons still existed. One such letter traveled across an ocean and a ruined continent to a village in Bavaria. The envelope was dirt-smudged, the paper thin from handling. It was read aloud in a small kitchen where neighbors gathered to hear news of anyone still breathing. "Dear Mother," the voice trembled as it spoke, "I am well. The Americans are kind. Tell the children I will bring them chocolate when I return." When the reader finished, no one moved. Someone wept. Outside, a cow lowed in the empty yard; inside, there was only the sound of the wind through broken glass. At Hearn, Captain Harold Evans read a reply sent weeks later to another prisoner, a gray-haired private named Otto Reinhardt. The letter was short. "Dear son, I am glad you are fed. Here, we eat once a day. Stay where you are. At least there you are safe." Otto folded the page carefully and carried it in his pocket for days, rereading it until the ink began to fade. He stopped joining meals, claiming he wasn't hungry. When the cook asked why, Otto said quietly, "I have more than my mother." A few of the guards noticed the shift. After the war, they expected celebration, men cheering the end of duty, the promise of home. Instead, the camp grew quieter. The laughter from the soccer field thinned. Work slowed. It wasn't rebellion, it was shame. Many of the prisoners began to understand the true shape of what they'd fought for, not glory, but emptiness. They saw photos in newspapers of cities that no longer existed, children standing barefoot among ruins, flags gone limp over bones. And the kindness that once confused them now became unbearable. A guard found Becker one night sitting by the fence, staring into the darkness. "You all right, buddy?" he asked. Becker nodded without looking up. "Yes," he said. "But it's strange. I am freer here than I was at home." The guard didn't know what to say. He handed him a cigarette, and they smoked in silence until the stars turned silver. Some men began asking to stay in America after release. Not out of betrayal, but fear of what waited for them beyond the ocean. In one report, Evans wrote, several POWs requested resettlement. They believe they have learned too much of peace to return to the old country. The irony was heavy, even cruel. They had come as enemies and were now afraid of the very homeland that once defined them. Karl Muller, the diarist, summarized it best. "We were fed not only food, but a new way of thinking. The pie was not just kindness, it was a mirror. It showed us who we might have been, if we had chosen differently." By September, the heat faded, the fields turned gold, and release orders began to arrive. Men packed small bags, folded their American-issued shirts, and said quiet goodbyes to guards who had long since stopped being strangers. A few cried. Most didn't. They stood at the gate, looking out at the wide Texas sky, at the country that had treated them like men when the world called them monsters. For the first time, they feared not the enemy, but the idea of going back. Years later, one of those prisoners returned to Texas. He brought an apple pie. It was 1955. The war had been over for a decade, but its echoes still lived in photographs, in the missing names on village memorials, and in the habits men couldn't unlearn. The visitor was older now, his hair gray at the temples, his hands rough from farming outside Bremen. His name was Karl Muller. He stepped out of a rental car and stood before what remained of Camp Hearn. The barracks were gone. The fences, too. Only a few concrete foundations and a sign that read historical site. The air still carried that dry, sweet smell of Texas dust, the same heat he remembered from the day he arrived in chains. In his hands, wrapped in a towel, he held the pie. It wasn't perfect, the crust uneven, the apples slightly overcooked, but it was made with care. On top, he had carved a single word with a knife before baking, Danke. He placed it on a wooden bench near the museum door, along with a small folded note. To those who treated us like men when the world forgot what that meant. Inside, the exhibits were quiet, uniforms behind glass, photographs of smiling guards and wary prisoners, the yellowed pages of censored letters. One photo stopped him, a kitchen crew lined up behind a counter, a pie cooling on the windowsill. He recognized the face of Joe Marino, the cook who'd once told him, "We all lost someone, friend." Karl stood there for a long time. He whispered something no one heard, maybe an apology, maybe a prayer. The curator, a young woman who hadn't been born during the war, approached gently. "Were you here?" she asked. He nodded. "A long time ago. It was not the worst place to be." Outside, the sky was enormous, the color of faded linen. He walked to the field where the soccer pitch had been, now overgrown with wild grass and yellow flowers. The wind moved across it like a slow wave. For a moment, he could almost hear the laughter again, boots thudding, shouts in German and English, the whistle of a guard who'd forgotten he was supposed to sound stern. He bent down, pressed his hand to the earth, and closed his eyes. "You taught us mercy," he said quietly. In the years after the war, hundreds of former POWs wrote letters to American newspapers. They thanked their captors, not for leniency, but for humanity. Some even returned to live in the United States. Others sent gifts, knitted scarves, postcards, family photographs. One letter, found in the archives, read, "In your camps, I learned what decency looks like. I brought it home with me, though my country had forgotten the word." By the 1960s, a small granite plaque was placed where the main gate once stood. It reads, "Humanity survived here." When veterans visited, they left more than flowers. One man left a spoon. Another, a photograph of a kitchen table. And once a year, on the anniversary of the camp's opening, someone anonymous sent a pie to the museum, warm, homemade, the crust dusted with sugar. No note. No name. Just the smell that said everything words couldn't. A recording survives of a former guard, made late in life. His voice trembles, but the message is clear. "I never thought kindness could win a war. But maybe it did." The sound of a chair creaking, the clink of a coffee cup. Then silence. The narrator's voice returns, low and certain. "They came as enemies. They left as men who learned what mercy tastes like." A pause, the soft breath of wind through grass, the distant hum of life continuing. "History remembers the bombs," he says finally. "But sometimes, it's the pie that ends the war."